At 4:30 in the morning, while the rest of the city still slept under a blanket of distant traffic and flickering neon signs, Inez was already awake. Her hands, rough and scarred from years of labor, moved with practiced efficiency. In the dim corner of a small room, she brewed strong coffee, packed 2 modest lunchboxes, and whispered gently into the ears of 2 sleeping girls. Natalia and Bianca, 7 and 9, stirred under her touch. Their faces were soft with dreams, their hair tangled from restless sleep. Inez kissed their foreheads, smoothing down their hair as she helped them into school uniforms worn thin from use. Natalia, her voice muffled by sleep, asked if her aunt would be late again. Inez, kneeling to fasten her shoes, replied softly that she'd be back by 6. Senora Rosario would look after them for a few hours. But they had to behave. She didn't say this like a warning. It was a promise. One she'd built a life around keeping. By 7, the girls were dropped at the school gates, their lunchboxes swinging at their sides. Inez turned away and disappeared into the bowels of Mexico City, joining the quiet army of women who crossed neighborhoods and boroughs before the city could even blink. Her journey spanned nearly 2 hours, 3 buses, tight spaces, and an orchestra of tires, coughs, and vendors shouting over engine noise. From the cracked sidewalks of Tláhuac to the manicured avenues of Lomas de Chapultepec, the contrast was jarring. Her destination stood like a monument, a tower of glass and stone that caught the morning light like a crown. Inside the top floor of that building, Victor Salgado was already in his office. He wasn't early. He was always precisely on time. At 43, Victor had shaped the world to match his vision. Salgado Tech was his empire, grown from nothing. His penthouse overlooked the city like a fortress, all sharp angles and immaculate surfaces. He read the same report 3 times without blinking. The numbers weren't the problem. It was everything else. When the intercom crackled to life, informing. Him! The new domestic assistant had arrived. He straightened his tie more out of routine than vanity. The last 3 hires had failed to meet his standards. Too noisy, too curious, too slow. He opened the door expecting indifference, and found something else. Inez stood straight, neither nervous nor defiant. Her clothes were simple but neat, her posture respectful without being submissive. She introduced herself calmly and added that the agency had given her the basics, but she preferred to know his personal preferences directly. Victor gave her the tour. The instructions came in clipped phrases. Breakfast at 7, silent work during meetings, separate laundry processes by material, dinner at 8, no visitors, no calls during work hours, and strict confidentiality. She nodded once and asked, "No questions." It was the absence of reaction that stayed with him after she left the room. Over the next few days, she moved through his world like vapor, unseen but deeply felt. When he left for meetings, the place sparkled. When he returned, his suits were arranged with mathematical precision. Lunch arrived warm and balanced. His espresso machine, once temperamental, now hummed obediently. Still, every evening, at exactly 6, she left. Without fail, without pause. He noticed the urgency, the precision. Most staff in her position lingered, stayed for extra hours, earned more, or simply waited to be noticed. Inez never did. One afternoon he offered to compensate her for overtime. She smiled politely and declined. "I have responsibilities." No explanation followed. That response stayed with him long after she was gone. On the 3rd evening, Victor found himself watching her as she wiped down the windows in silence. There was something about the way she worked, not frantic but focused, like someone who had learned to think in silence. She didn't hum, didn't speak to herself, just moved, cleaned, folded, breathed. When she glanced up and caught him watching, he quickly looked back at his laptop. But the spell had been broken. That night, he stood alone in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows, The city glittered below, but he felt distant from it. The apartment around him was quiet, perfect, and lifeless. He'd built a world without mess, without noise, without questions. And now, one woman's absence at precisely 6 o'clock was starting to feel like a void he couldn't name. There was something about her. The way she moved through luxury without belonging to it. The way she spoke only when needed, as if every word cost her something. She never asked for more, never lingered near expensive things, never commented on the extravagance that surrounded her. Who was she really? What was her story? Why did she carry herself with the restraint of someone who had survived something? Victor didn't have answers. Not yet. But something inside him, quiet and unfamiliar, whispered that there was more to her than folded napkins and silent exits. That she was walking towards something, or running from something, with every bus she took across the city. He didn't know it then, but the questions forming in his chest were not the beginning of curiosity. They were the beginning of a storm, and the truth, when it came, would break through the silence he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. The following day, Victor stayed home longer than usual. He told himself it was to review contracts in peace, but the truth sat more quietly in the back of his mind. He left the study door slightly ajar, a small crack in his usual fortress of solitude. From where he sat, he could hear the faint sounds of movement, drawers opening and closing, cloth brushing across polished surfaces, the soft rhythm of a broom. Inez was methodical, as always. No perfume, no humming, no unnecessary footsteps, just efficiency made flesh. But Victor wasn't listening for sounds. He was waiting for the absence of them, the moment the apartment returned to its usual sterile silence, signaling she had left. That was when the quiet had started to feel heavier. By 5:50, she was already changing back into her street clothes. At exactly 6, as expected, she passed by the study to say she was leaving. Her voice, like always, was measured, polite, devoid of expectation. Then she vanished down the private elevator like a ghost timed to a metronome. That evening, Victor found himself pacing. Something itched in his thoughts. He walked to the window and stared down at the street, watching figures move between traffic and light. He saw her emerge near the gate, small against the frame of the building, stepping out into a world so far from the one he had built, and without thinking, he moved. He left his office, grabbed his coat, and took the stairs, something he hadn't done in years. He didn't want her to see him. He didn't know what he was doing. Only that the urge to follow her burned louder than reason. Outside, he kept a cautious distance. She didn't notice. She never looked back. She boarded the metro, standing like everyone else, one hand holding onto a pole, the other clutching her old bag. She looked ahead, unmoving, while bodies pressed in around her. Victor, unused to the chaos, stumbled his way into the crowd, trying to blend in with people who didn't wear tailored shirts or Italian leather. 3 transfers and nearly an hour later, the city had transformed. The glass buildings were long gone, replaced by low rooftops, tangled wires, and narrow streets where the sidewalk was more suggestion than rule. He followed her into the outskirts of Iztapalapa, a neighborhood more remembered than maintained. Trash clung to fences. Dogs barked in the distance. The air carried the sharp scent of burning plastic and cheap detergent. She turned down an alley, then another, until she arrived at a vacant lot that had been turned into a settlement. Makeshift homes stood side by side, structures built from wood, metal sheets, and salvaged fabric. Laundry hung between beams. Children chased each other barefoot. Adults cooked over shared fires. She stepped inside one of the shelters, no larger than a storage room. The walls were patched with plastic, tarps, the door, a curtain. And then came the sound. 2 little voices called out, high-pitched and excited. "Tia Inés!" Victor froze behind a crumbling post. The transformation was instant. The tension in her shoulders melted. She knelt and opened her arms as the 2 girls ran into them, laughing. She She kissed their foreheads and pulled two small mandarins from her bag like treasures. His breath caught. This wasn't just the woman who cleaned his home. This was someone entirely different. She was their whole world. Inside the makeshift home, she lit a small stove and began to cook. The girls took out their notebooks, showing her drawings and homework. She praised each one, patient and present. Even as she prepared dinner in the tiniest of kitchens, a single mattress occupied most of the space. Some boxes served as shelves. The walls were decorated with crayon-colored paper hearts, names scribbled in glitter pens, and one faded photograph of a smiling woman with long, dark hair. As the girls talked, one of them whispered something that made Inez pause. Then she smiled, real and luminous, the kind of smile Victor had never seen in his pristine penthouse. He watched as she divided a single piece of chicken into 3, giving herself the smallest portion. After dinner, she helped with homework, washed dishes in a cracked basin, and pulled out a thin mat for herself to sleep on the floor. At one point, an elderly woman peeked in and asked if the new employer was treating her well. Inez nodded and said quietly that he was respectful and paid on time. The older woman smiled with a sigh of relief. "You deserve some luck, Hia," she said, before disappearing into the darkness. Later that night, as the girls curled up under one thin blanket, Inez pulled them close and whispered a prayer. Victor could barely make out the words, but he heard just enough. "Protect Mama in heaven. Help us find a real house someday. Thank you for my job." Something inside him cracked. He turned away, walking quickly back to the avenue. The metro was no longer running, so he hailed a cab. The ride back to his luxurious building felt unreal, like waking from a dream too fragile to describe. Images from that evening played over and over in his mind. Inez serving food she barely touched, brushing Bianca's hair with the same care she folded napkins, whispering to the night as if someone were still listening. Back in his apartment, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and didn't drink it. He sat by the window with the skyline blinking back at him and whispered the names he had just learned. Natalia, Bianca. He felt the weight of them. Names that didn't belong in the boardroom, or on spreadsheets, or in quarterly reports, but names that now filled the silence of his home. For the first time in years, Victor Salgado felt ashamed of what he had. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he felt an overwhelming need to do something that didn't serve his portfolio, his image, or his control. He didn't know what it would be, but it would begin with those girls. In the days that followed, Victor's morning routine began to shift, subtly at first. He no longer buried himself in numbers before breakfast, or disappeared into meetings before noon. Instead, he lingered. Just long enough to hear the soft sounds of movement from the hallway, the familiar whisper of drawers opening, the clink of porcelain, the faint scent of lemon cleaner. Inez never paused. She moved through the apartment with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago learned not to take up space in the lives of others. But Victor noticed her now, not just her presence, but the absence she left behind when she stepped out at 6 sharp. He began to leave things out, small things. A forgotten fruit bowl filled with apples, a package of cookies left on the kitchen counter. Once, a box of colored pencils he'd ordered for a presentation that never happened. He said nothing. She didn't comment either. But gradually the items stopped being ignored. An apple would be missing the next morning, the cookie wrapper gone, the pencils replaced neatly in the drawer. Victor started eating at home more often. He claimed the food was better, but the truth was simpler. He wanted to stay close, not in a way he fully understood, but enough to know that her presence had become the soft heartbeat of his once sterile space. It was over one of those meals, a quiet lunch with chicken soup and tortillas, folded with perfect care, that he asked the question, not directly, just enough to start pulling at the thread. You always worked in private homes? Inez, standing at the far end of the kitchen, paused only briefly before replying. Since I was 16. She didn't elaborate. He waited. When nothing followed, he asked another. What did you do before that? A silence hung between them. Not tense, just considered. I worked in a factory, sewing, but the hours didn't allow for other responsibilities. That word, responsibilities. He clung to it. Children? He asked gently. My nieces, she said, eyes still on the dishes. Natalia and Bianca. They've been with me since their mother passed away. There was no tremor in her voice, just the quiet weight of truth laid down carefully. I'm sorry, Victor said, and he meant it. We do what we must, she replied, finally turning to face him. They're what I have now. He didn't ask about their father. Something in her eyes told him not to. From that day, the air between them softened. He began finding reasons to speak with her, not as a boss, but as someone trying to understand. He asked if the girls liked school, if she cooked the same meals at home, if she ever rested. The answers were always brief, but not cold. One Friday afternoon, he came home early and placed 2 small packages on the kitchen table, nothing extravagant. 2 dolls, identical except for the color of their dresses. He told himself it was harmless. He left no note, only waited to see what would happen. On Monday, she returned as usual. Nothing was said until she placed his breakfast on the table. The girls, they liked the gifts. Her voice was neutral, but her eyes gave her away. I'm glad, he replied, pretending not to feel the warmth blooming in his chest. That week, the house felt different, not fuller, not busier, just warmer. Music for the first time filled the background. A soft hum of Juan Gabriel echoing faintly through the halls as Inez moved between rooms, folding, cleaning, arranging. He didn't tell her to turn it down. He listened. By the end of the week, he was spending more time in the kitchen, arriving early to meals, offering small talk that grew steadily more personal. One afternoon, she brought coffee to his study, placing it beside his laptop with her. Usual quiet efficiency. As she turned to leave, he asked without lifting his eyes, what happened to their mother? She didn't answer immediately. He almost regretted asking, but then in a voice both steady and distant, she spoke. Her name was Mariella, my sister. She was stronger than me, smarter. She worked in housekeeping too, raised the girls alone. Never asked for help. Victor looked up. She was still standing by the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. 3 years ago, she continued, she was hit by a car while crossing Avenida Tláhuac after work. The driver didn't stop. No one ever found out who it was. The words hung in the air like smoke, unsettled, lingering. She was everything to them, Inez added quietly. And to me. Victor felt the air shift. For the first time, the glass walls he had built around his life began to tremble. Later that night, alone in his office, he pulled out a drawer of archived reports. An internal audit he had requested weeks earlier for unrelated reasons had finally been delivered. He scanned it absently, fleet usage, company vehicles, incident reports, until one line caught his eye. A black Mercedes from Salgado Tech's executive fleet. Involved in a hit-and-run, Avenue, Tláhuac date, 3 years ago. Victim, female, 34. Status, deceased, case unresolved. Victor stared at the document, his pulse slowing. Then he saw the name, Mariella Avila. His breath left him. He opened the attached photo. The resemblance was unmistakable. The curve of the smile, the arch of the brow. The same eyes he saw in Natalia and Bianca, the girls. His hands trembled, pages rustled, his vision blurred. He had no memory of this incident. None. The former head of security, Martín Herrera, had handled all fleet incidents, quietly, efficiently. Victor had signed repair approvals without reading them, trusted his team, trusted the silence. He was implicated. Even if unknowingly. He closed the folder and placed his palms flat on the desk, pressing against the cold surface as if it could hold him up. The silence of the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. The woman who filled his home with quiet grace was the sister of a victim. The girls who now slept on a shared mattress were orphaned by the negligence of a man from his company, a man he once called a friend. He stood there for a long time, unmoving. The only sound was the faint click of the wall clock marking time he could no longer undo. Everything he thought he knew about his world had shifted, and for the first time in his life, Victor Salgado didn't know what to do next. The file sat untouched on Victor's desk the entire weekend. He didn't open it again, though the contents burned like an ember behind his eyes. The name, the date, the image. Mariela Avila. A woman who had walked the same path as Inez, who had carried 2 girls across the same distances, who had worked late hours to feed them, only to be struck down and forgotten. The driver had never been found. But now Victor knew, at least partially, and that alone was enough to dismantle everything he believed about his company and himself. He barely slept. The silence of his apartment, once comforting, became unbearable. He stopped listening to music. He skipped meals. On Monday morning, he watched the clock tick past 6, past 7, waiting. He didn't know how to face her. Not yet. When Inez arrived, she was as composed as ever, her routine undisturbed. She offered a quiet greeting and went straight to the kitchen. He heard the sound of a pan warming, the coffee machine hissing, plates being arranged. He couldn't bear it, not knowing what he now knew. Victor sat through breakfast like a man underwater. He nodded at her soft updates. Breakfast was ready. Laundry was finished. She'd cleaned the terrace tiles, but barely responded. He kept seeing that name flash behind his eyes, kept hearing her voice telling him about Mariela and the night she never came home. Later that afternoon, he called Martin Herrera, the former head of security, the man who had handled fleet incidents for years, who had been quietly retired with a generous severance package last year. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "You remember that black Mercedes in 2022? Victor asked, not wasting time. Herrera's tone sharpened instantly. "Which one?" "Avenida. Tlahuac, hit and run." There was silence on the line. Then a sigh. "Victor, we handled that already. It was Villarreal's car. He'd been drinking after a dinner meeting. No press coverage, no internal scandal. It's done." Victor's stomach turned. "He killed someone." "It was an accident, a bad one. But do you really want to stir this up now? The company survived because we buried it." "Buried it." The words hit like a slap. "You forged my signature, didn't you?" Victor asked, his voice cold. "We didn't need to. You signed the maintenance order, remember? Routine repairs, fleet expenses, nothing unusual. Legal wouldn't touch you if you didn't know the Yasum details." The call ended soon after. Victor sat still, the phone resting in his palm like a confession. He wasn't the one behind the wheel, but he was the one who had signed, the one who had trusted blindly, the one who had built a system that made it easy to silence the truth. That night, he paced the apartment, each step echoing louder than the last. Every surface felt artificial, every light too bright. He picked up the file again, stared at Mariela's smiling face, and imagined the moment her daughters waited for her to return. And waited, and never saw her again. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about justice, even if it came years too late. The next morning, Victor called his lawyer. He asked for a full review of the 2022 incident. All records, all communications, all signatures. He wanted names. He wanted a timeline. and he wanted a case prepared. His lawyer hesitated. If you press charges, it will link back to Salgado. Tech. This won't just cost you a few headlines. It could bring the entire board against you. Victor didn't flinch. Do it anyway. That afternoon, he met with his accountant. He instructed him to open a private trust fund in the names of Natalia and Bianca Avila. Enough to cover their education through university. Enough to build a new home. Enough to change the path they'd been pushed onto without warning. But there was one thing Victor hadn't accounted for. Truth, no matter how tightly contained, has a way of slipping through cracks. 3 days later, while cleaning his office, Inez accidentally knocked a folder from the edge of his desk. It opened on impact, scattering papers across the polished floor. She knelt quickly to gather them, but her hands froze when she saw a photo face up on the ground. Her sister, Mariela, smiling, alive. She stared at the name typed underneath, the date, the report title. Her breathing shallowed. Her eyes moved rapidly across the page. Each sentence cut deeper than the last. Details she'd begged the authorities for, proof they'd told her didn't exist, witnesses, damage reports, internal communications. The driver had been a Salgado tech executive, her employer's company. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She gathered the papers slowly, stacked them with precision, and placed them on the desk, open, visible. Then she walked out. When Victor returned home that night, the apartment felt wrong, too quiet. The scent of cleaning products lingered in the air, but nothing had been finished. The dining table was untouched. No lights were turned off. The hallway felt colder than usual. In the office, he found the file on the desk, open, and he knew. He stood in silence, staring down at the photo, now staring back at him. Then he turned and walked to the terrace where he found her. She was sitting in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable as she looked out at the lights of the city. She didn't look up when he approached. I didn't want you to find out like this, he said quietly. Her voice, when it came, was almost detached. 3 years. I looked for answers for 3 years. I didn't know, he said. Not until last week. I swear it to you. She turned to him then. There was no anger in her eyes, only something deeper, exhaustion perhaps, or heartbreak that had passed through fire and emerged numb. But you do now, she said. And you still didn't tell me. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Your company buried her death to protect itself, and you were a part of that system, whether you meant to be or not. He nodded. I know. I've been cleaning the home of the people who erased my sister. There was no bitterness in her voice. That was what made it worse. He stepped closer. I've filed charges against the man responsible. I've created a fund for your nieces. I know it's not enough. It'll never be enough. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Why? She asked, almost in a whisper. Because you deserve the truth. Because they deserve justice. Because your sister was more than a footnote. And because I care about you. She looked away. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said after a long pause. Not yet. He nodded. I'm not asking for that. Just don't disappear. Please. Inez stood, her posture composed as ever. But something inside her had shifted. I need time, she said simply. And then she walked past him, toward the door. The apartment felt hollow after she left. Not just empty, stripped, as if her presence had been the quiet thread holding it all together, and now that thread had snapped. The walls echoed differently. The light through the windows seemed colder. Even the silence, once his ally, had turned against him. Victor didn't sleep that night. He wandered the rooms aimlessly, picking up objects and putting them down without purpose. Her touch lingered in small places. The perfectly folded towels, the smell of lemon and clean linen, the softness of a coffee mug she favored. And yet, her absence screamed louder than any noise he'd ever known. He had no idea if she would come back. The next morning, he showered without urgency and skipped breakfast entirely. The thought of eating felt absurd. His phone buzzed with messages, news alerts, missed calls, a reminder about a board meeting. None of it mattered. But one message caught his attention. His attorney had filed the formal charges against Eduardo Villarreal. The complaint included documentation of the hit and run, testimony from the audit, repair records, and an internal memo revealing the cover-up. There was enough to prosecute. That same morning, Javier Medina, the former head of security, was also served with a subpoena for obstruction, tampering, suppression of evidence. Victor read the email again and again, not because he doubted the facts, but because the weight of action had never felt so heavy. The truth was out. And now the storm would begin. The media got hold of the story by noon. By 3 o'clock, headlines were everywhere. Tech empire implicated in fatal hit-and-run cover-up. The image they used was one of Victor at a conference, smiling in Didendiaga, in front of a Salgado Tech logo. Now it looked like irony. The board of directors held an emergency meeting that night. He didn't wait for them to demand his resignation. He offered it before they could speak. Some tried to protest, said the company needed stability. Others were quiet, their eyes filled with something that looked like fear, or worse, disappointment. He didn't try to explain. He didn't blame them. His fall wasn't sudden. It was overdue. And he had chosen it willingly. When he left the building for the last time, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt human. For the first time in years, he wasn't protected by glass, or title, or wealth. He was just a man who had failed to look deeply enough, until it was too late. He returned to the apartment that night as a different version of himself. No longer the CEO, no longer untouchable, just Victor. A man with questions he couldn't answer, and hopes he no longer knew how to voice. Days passed. Inez didn't come back, but her absence didn't fade. He thought of calling, of writing, of finding her. But each time he hesitated. She had asked for time. Time to breathe, to process, to grieve again. So he waited. Not because he hoped she would forgive him quickly, but because he finally understood he had no right to ask. Meanwhile, in a modest home stitched together from borrowed wood and iron sheets, Inez moved through her own storm. She told the girls that work had changed. She didn't give details. She didn't say that she had walked away from the man who had made their life easier, or that the truth she'd begged to find had been sitting in a folder next to a cappuccino machine. At night, when Natalia and Bianca were asleep, she sat by the window and stared into the dark. She thought of Mariela, her laughter, her stubbornness, the way she always found a way to make even the worst days feel manageable. What would her sister have done? Would she have raged? Stayed silent? Would she have accepted justice served 3 years too late? More than once, Inez pulled out the file she had secretly copied. She read it again, line by line, as if expecting it to change. As if somehow, by staring at the words hard enough, she could undo what had been done. But it never changed. She found herself thinking about Victor, about the way he had looked at her that night. Not defensive, not cold, but exposed. Like a man who finally saw the edge of his own ignorance. And still, he hadn't hidden. He had taken action. The dolls he had given the girls still sat on their makeshift shelf. Bianca slept with hers every night, arms wrapped tightly around it like a secret. Natalia, more reserved, had carefully placed hers next to her pillow, where it could always see her. Inez wanted to believe that people could change. She just didn't know if she was ready to let them. A week later, the neighborhood children were playing outside when a black car pulled up at the edge of the lot. It didn't belong. It was too clean, too quiet, too expensive. Natalia and Bianca were sitting on a blanket coloring when they noticed. They whispered to each other, then looked toward the shelter. A few moments later, there was a knock, gentle, uncertain. Inez opened the curtain slowly. Her heart stopped. He was thinner, his eyes tired, but his posture was humble, unsure. He didn't step forward. "I didn't come to ask anything of you," he said quietly. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." She didn't answer at first. She wasn't sure what to say. He looked down, then back at her. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I couldn't leave things unsaid. I gave up the company, pressed the charges. The man responsible will go to trial. The security chief, too. I've also set up a trust. Your nieces will never lack again. It's already active." Her throat tightened. She wanted to be angry, but her heart remembered the way he had treated the girls, the way he had spoken their names like they mattered, the way Bianca had asked weeks ago if they could call him Papa. "I still have a lot to figure out," she said softly. "I know. I don't know what any of this means." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know that I want to keep trying, and not just to make amends." He looked past her shoulder for a moment. "I want to build something better, not just fix what's broken." Silence settled between them. Not cold this time, just stillness. Behind her, the girls peeked out. Bianca's face lit up, and she ran forward before Inez could stop her. "Leo!" she shouted. Inez turned, startled. "His name is Victor, Carino." Bianca frowned. "But he looks like Leo, like the lion from my storybook. He always helps people." Victor laughed softly, wiping his eyes. Natalia stepped forward too, more reserved, but her expression softer than before. "Are you staying for dinner?" Inez looked from the girls to the man who had once been a stranger, then a storm, and now something she couldn't name. "I don't know," she said. Then she stepped aside and added, almost imperceptibly, "But you can come in." Victor didn't step inside like a man returning home. He entered like someone aware that every inch of ground was borrowed. He lowered his head slightly, almost reverent, as he crossed the curtain threshold of the shelter that somehow felt warmer than any of his penthouse rooms ever had. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The mattress still sat tucked into the far wall. A few crayons lay scattered across a corner rug, and the little wooden shelf held a makeshift flower vase made from a coffee jar. It wasn't elegance that struck him. It was presence. Life. Bianca ran to fetch the dolls and sat cross-legged at his feet, her voice a blur of excitement as she introduced them again, even though he remembered their names. Natalia watched from the side, silent but curious, her coloring book clutched to her chest like a shield. Inez offered him coffee, not out of obligation, but custom, perhaps, a small ritual of civility rooted deep in her bones. She made it over. The portable burner, the rich scent filling the small space with a warmth that rivaled the stove's heat. When she handed him the chipped mug, their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away, but neither lingered. They sat at the edge of the mattress, shoulder to shoulder, but not quite touching. Bianca babbled in the background, narrating an imaginary tea party with her doll, while Natalia eventually settled beside her, quietly drawing. The silence between Inez and Victor stretched long, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed. It asked questions and offered space for answers that hadn't yet found words. "I've thought about that day," he said finally, voice low. "Over and over. The folder, your face, the look in your eyes when you saw it." Inez didn't respond. She sipped her coffee slowly, eyes fixed on the flicker of the stove. I didn't sleep for nights after, he continued. Not because I was afraid of consequences, but because I realized I had been living blind in a world I claimed to control. That made her look at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, not coldly, just cautiously. "Because silence can be just as violent as action, and I've been silent for too long." The words hovered. Inez placed her mug down gently and leaned forward, her voice quiet but steady. "I was angry, not just at you, at everything. At how the system buried her, at how we kept breathing when she didn't, at how the world keeps moving, even when yours has stopped." Victor nodded. "I don't want to be part of that world anymore." She looked at him for a long time. Not with softness. Not yet. But with something new. Recognition. "There's something I need you to understand," she said. "I'm listening. I don't need saving. I never have. My girls don't need a hero. What we need is respect, truth. Someone who stays, not just when it's convenient." He held her gaze. "I know." A pause. Then she added, "You can't rewrite the past, but you can choose how you live with it." Later, as the sun began to fall beyond the rooftops and cast golden light over patched-up walls, Bianca tugged at Victor's sleeve. "Will you come back tomorrow?" He looked to Inez before answering. "If it's okay with your tia," he said gently. Inez didn't speak right away. Then finally, she gave a quiet nod. The smallest invitation, but real. That night, back in his apartment, Victor didn't drink, didn't scroll through news, didn't read shareholder emails. He sat in the silence that once suffocated him, and this time, it didn't feel as empty. The next day, he returned, and the next. Not every visit was long, nor full of conversation. Some afternoons were spent helping Natalia with math homework, while Bianca climbed onto his lap to braid his hair with ribbons. Inez watched, sometimes amused, sometimes silent. But slowly, the space between them filled. One Sunday, as they all shared tamales in the park, Victor pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I brought something," he said. "For the girls." He handed it to Inez. She unfolded it slowly. Her eyes widened. It was a document from the trust, a letter from the new lawyer managing the fund. Official proof that Natalia and Bianca's education was secured, through high school, through college, fully covered. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, fingers tightening on the paper. "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "I just wanted to make sure they'd never feel the kind of fear you've had to carry." For a long time, she said nothing. But that night, as they walked back to the lot, Natalia slipped her hand into Victor's without hesitation. Later, after the girls had gone to bed and the moonlight seeped through the makeshift window, Inez and Victor sat outside, side by side on overturned crates. He turned to her. "Do you think your sister would hate me?" She looked up at the stars. "No," she said finally. "I think she'd want me to move forward, not with rage, but with strength." He swallowed hard. "And what about you?" he asked. "Can you move forward with me?" She didn't answer right away, but then she looked at him, and there was no wall between them anymore. "I'm trying," she said, "and that's enough. And that's..." When she leaned her head on his shoulder, it was gentle. Not a surrender, but a quiet moment of trust. No promises, no declarations. Just breath shared in silence. A silence that no longer hurt. It had become a quiet tradition. Once a month, on Tiao. A Saturday morning, Inez would take the girls to the cemetery at the edge of the city. They didn't dress in black or speak in whispers. Instead, they carried flowers, whatever they could afford or pick, and small updates folded on slips of paper. Bianca brought drawings. Natalia, grades. Inez always brought silence. That morning, for the first time, Victor came with them. He didn't ask. Inez didn't invite. But when he appeared outside the shelter with a bouquet of fresh white gardenias and a thermos of hot cinnamon tea, she met his eyes and gave a soft nod. They walked together through the rows of stone, past names that told stories no one remembered, toward the modest plaque where Mariela Avila's name was etched into metal. The girls rushed ahead, already pulling things from their little backpacks, crayon-colored letters, a toy, a bag of cookies, in case Mama got hungry in heaven. Victor stood back. He had never been there before, but somehow it felt familiar, like a place that had lived inside Inez's silence since the day they met. Inez knelt by the grave, her hands pressing gently against the cool stone. Her eyes closed, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time, not since that first night on the floor, holding the girls, whispering to Mariela that she didn't know how to do this without her. Natalia placed her drawing beside the flowers. "I got a 9 in math," she said softly. "Leo helped me study," Bianca whispered. "We made pizza last week. It burned a little, but he ate it anyway." The girls turned toward Victor, who stood a respectful distance away. Bianca beckoned him forward. "She doesn't bite," she said with a grin. He approached slowly. The air felt different, lighter, not because the grief had vanished, but because it had somewhere to go. Inez spoke without looking at him. She loved flowers, especially wild ones, said they had more courage than store-bought ones. Victor smiled. Then she would have liked the girls. They're wild in the best way. They stood in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Later, as they walked back through the city, they stopped by a park. Natalia chased Bianca across the grass while Victor and Inez sat on a bench nearby, sharing the last of the cinnamon tea. "She would have been proud of you," he said quietly. Inez shook her head, half smiling. "She would have told me I was doing too much. Then taken over, bossed everyone around, and made it look easy. I wish I had met her. I wish she could see them now, laughing, safe." Victor hesitated. "They feel safe with me." Inez looked at him. "Yes, they do. And I do too." Exhaled, tension he hadn't noticed leaving his shoulders. "I sold the apartment," he said, almost casually. Her eyes widened. "The penthouse. It never felt like home, not after I saw yours." He told her he had bought a place in Coyoacan. A modest, colorful apartment with 3 bedrooms, a tiny balcony, and noisy neighbors. He described the way the light spilled through the kitchen window in the morning, and how he was learning to use a regular stove, one that didn't speak in Wi-Fi signals. "You bought a new place just like that?" she asked, still surprised. "No," he smiled. "Not just like that. It took me years to realize what I wanted, then minutes to realize what I didn't." She looked down at the thermos in her lap, turning it slowly in her hands. "And what do you want now?" "You," he said simply. "Not because I pity you, not because I want to fix you, but because you showed me who I really am, who I could be." She looked at him then, really looked. And in his eyes there was no grand gesture, no polished speech, just a man telling the truth. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "So am I," he replied. "But I'm more scared of losing the chance to live honestly, with you, with them, even if it takes time." She reached for his hand. And this time, she didn't let go. That night, back in the shelter, the girls sat huddled over a sheet of paper, drawing floor plans of the imaginary house they would live in one day. "A room for me, one for you, one for Mama," said Bianca. Natalia paused. "And one for Leo?" They both looked at Inez. She smiled. "If he agrees to help cook." "I'll even do dishes," Victor called from the corner. "Every day?" Bianca gasped. "We'll negotiate," he laughed. The light that evening was soft, the kind of light that catches in eyelashes and spills across the floor like something sacred. Later, while the girls slept, Inez and Victor sat in silence again, this time in front of the shelter, watching the stars poke through the city's haze. She pulled a worn photo of Mariella from her wallet, held it between them. "Sometimes I talk to her when I'm alone," she said. "I ask if I'm doing this right." Victor looked at the photo. "What do you think she'd say now?" Inez thought for a moment, then smiled. "She'd say, I'm finally starting to live." The smell of freshly baked cookies drifted from the kitchen, while the morning sun spilled across the living room floor. Laughter echoed down the hallway, light and uncontrolled, as Natalia tried, unsuccessfully, to teach Bianca how to fold a picnic blanket without turning it into a tangled mess. It had been 8 months since they moved into the new apartment in Coyoacán. The colors on the walls were warm, the furniture simple, and every corner held signs of a life being lived, not curated. Crayons on the coffee table, socks that never quite made it to the hamper, a fridge door covered in drawings, and gold star stickers. Victor stood by the kitchen counter, packing the picnic basket with a kind of care that made it look like a ritual. 2 juice boxes, extra napkins, cookies still warm, a container of fruit, sandwiches labeled by name, with silly little hearts drawn in permanent marker. Behind him, Inez leaned against the door frame, smiling. "You packed like we're feeding." "A whole park," she teased. He turned, mock offended. "I've learned to prepare for every scenario. Hunger strikes, surprise guests, cookie emergencies." She laughed softly and walked toward him. Her hair was pulled back into a loose braid. Her jeans faded, her shirt simple, but to him, she looked like grace in motion. "You didn't forget the thermos, did you?" she asked, reaching into the basket. "Forget cinnamon tea," he said. "I'm not that reckless anymore." The girls ran into the room just as the last spoon was packed. Bianca carried her new recorder flute and played 3 high-pitched, dissonant notes with great pride. "Ready!" she yelled, already wearing her backpack upside down. Natalia held up a book of math puzzles. "If there's time after lunch, can we do a few together?" Victor grinned. "Only if you promise not to correct me too harshly." They walked to the park together, the 4 of them, like a family that had never been anything else. The park was already filled with weekend buzz, bicycles weaving through grass, dogs chasing shadows, couples sprawled on blankets under tall trees. They found their usual spot beneath a jacaranda. Inez spread out the blanket while Victor unpacked the food like a man unveiling treasure. The girls ran to chase butterflies, their laughter floating back on the breeze like music. Inez sat beside him, watching the scene unfold. "Sometimes, I still think this isn't real," she murmured. "It's real," he said. "Messy, loud, sticky fingers and spilled juice. But real." She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. And enough. Later, as they passed around slices of mango and shared bites of still warm cookies, Bianca stopped mid-chew and looked up with sudden seriousness. "Leo?" He looked at her, wiping a crumb from her cheek. "Can we ask you something really, really big?" He glanced at Inez, who gave a small nod. "You can ask me anything." Bianca leaned closer, her voice soft. "Can we call you Papa?" Victor blinked. His breath caught in his throat. For a second, everything went still. The park, the air, even time itself. He didn't answer. Right away. Instead, he looked at Inez. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. She trusted him. She trusted them. This wasn't about replacing anyone. This was about choosing someone who had stayed. He turned back to the girls, kneeling down so he could see them eye to eye. "I would be honored," he said quietly, "but only if your Tia agrees, and only if I earn it. Every single day." Bianca squealed and hugged him tightly. Natalia, slower but just as certain, wrapped her arms around him too. Inez watched, eyes misted with something too complex to name. Love, loss, healing, hope. a kind of joy that wasn't loud or perfect, but deep and earned. That night, back in the apartment, the girls helped clean up after dinner, Natalia sweeping crumbs, Bianca attempting to dry dishes but mostly getting herself wet. Victor played music from a small speaker, old songs that filled the room with a rhythm that made even the walls sway gently. Inez emerged from the bedroom holding an envelope. "This came earlier," she said, handing it to him. It was a court letter. The final sentencing: Eduardo Villarreal, 6 years, Javier Medina, 3. Victor read it in silence, then folded the paper and set it aside. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. Just breathed deeply. "It's done," Inez said softly. "No," he replied. "It's just beginning." Later, when the girls were asleep, Inez and Victor sat on the small balcony. The city stretched out before them, blinking and alive, not perfect, but entirely theirs. "I've been thinking," Inez said. He turned to her, waiting. "I want to study. Not just finish school, but really learn. Administration, maybe, or finance." His face lit up. "You'd be amazing. I want to build something, not just survive, not just clean up other people's messes. I want to shape my own future." He took her hand. "Then we'll make it happen. Whatever it takes." The stars above were faint, hidden behind the glow of the city. But they were there, constant, waiting. 1 week later, they returned to the cemetery. The girls brought flowers. Again, this time yellow marigolds and tiny white daisies. Natalia had a new report card. Bianca had written a poem that rhymed pizza with princesa. Inez brought something different, a photograph. It was of the 4 of them, at the park, laughing. She placed it gently at the base of the plaque. "Gracias, hermana," she whispered. "Por todo." They stayed for a while, not to mourn, but to honor, to talk, to remember. And when they left, Victor carried Bianca on his shoulders while Natalia held his hand, telling him about the next school project. Inez walked beside them, her steps light, her eyes steady. The future still held uncertainty. There would be days of exhaustion, of conflict, of fear. But there would also be birthdays and music and love that grew not from ease, but from choice. As they disappeared into the noise of the world, one small, imperfect, beautiful family, the sky above began to change. The last light of the sun melted into the rooftops, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it should be.